He tended flocks and taught his son the names of things that endure, the covenant way of living among kin, the discipline of turning aside to speak beneath a tree, the making of prayer not as a list of wants, but as a shape of life. He moved among the people with a soft authority. Elders who had seen longer seasons came to him for counsel, and the young found in his steps an example that steadied their own. At 65 years of age, Enoch bore Methuselah. The naming of that child was a moment together of hope and warning. Enoch's voice, low and certain, set the name upon his son, with the sense that names carried fate and promise. Methuselah's name was fashioned like a watchword, a reminder of time, of waiting, of things that are measured by the long patience of God. Mothers and fathers stood and blessed the child, the tents hummed with songs, and Enoch lifted the infant to the sky as if in an offering and a pledge, that the generations would not forget the call to live in the sight of the Almighty. The years that followed were counted in a dual rhythm. For 300 years after the birth of his son, Enoch walked with God. He moved day by day in practices that made his soul recognizable, rising early to meet the dawn and offering thanks with the first light, stealing away at midday to the shadow of a rock to speak plainly with the one he loved, and coming home at evening with stories that were less of visions than of renewal, small reports of how his heart had been steadied, how his mind had been shown pity that could not be contained. He did not speak often of mysteries. When he did, the words came like incense, sparse, fragrant, and leaving a longing. In the gate of the place where the elders gathered, he sometimes stood and lifted a warning. He told them, with the firmness of one who has seen a thing coming, that the ways of men had a direction, and that heavenly patience had its limits. Those who listened heard not harangue, but sober counsel. Turn from violence and craft towards mercy and justice. Remember the Maker in the midst of prosperity. These messages were plain and direct. They were not meant to terrify, but to invite repentance. Not all received that invitation. Around Enoch, a world of men and women bent toward their own devices. They increased their strength, they multiplied their idols, and they hardened themselves in pursuits that measured success by dominion and luxury rather than by kinship with the Almighty. From the line of Cain there came a restlessness that fed upon invention and pride. Cities swelled, craftsmen learned faster hands. Where Enoch saw stewardship, others saw opportunity to dominate. Tensions grew not by sudden war, but by the steady turning of hearts away from remembrance. Families split in loyalty, as some heeded the old words and others chose the newer songs. Within that divide, Enoch's family stood as a kind of bulwark.
Jared's eyes, now dimmer with age, would brighten when Enoch returned from a day of walking with a report of small mercies. A distant neighbor who had been reconciled, a new mother aided in childbirth, a dispute solved without blood. Methuselah, quick to laugh and slow to wrath, sat at his father's feet and learned what it meant to speak with God as a friend. Grandfathers and aunts passed along the law of tenderness. To the poor, give bread. To the arrogant, reply with silence that is not contempt but restraint. It was a life shaped not primarily by doctrine, but by steady acts of neighborliness that carried a devotion in their seams. Enoch's voice, however, was not only domestic. The record that would later be set down in the epistle that bears the name of Jude calls him a prophet who spoke of coming judgment. His word reached beyond the tents, to the open fields, to the city gates, and to the ears of those who ruled in councils of elders. He described, in phrases held to the revealed truth, that the path of violence and arrogance would not continue without consequence. There would be a time when the making and breaking of human pride would meet the righteous judgment of the Creator. Yet even in that announcing of judgment there was mercy, a plea for return, an open hand for those who would walk the path of repentance. Those who were drawn to Enoch found in him a way of being that changed their labor and their festivals. They began to measure wealth differently, not by silver and houses, but by the number of ties mended, by the steadiness of their hearing in prayer. Enoch's companionship was contagious in the best sense. People who walked with him found themselves less impatient with gain and more ready to sit at a harvest table with a weary stranger. The community of the faithful was small and often ridiculed, yet within it the taste of true joy was not absent. Their songs were plain, instruments were reed and frame, not ornate, and their praise rose like incense that had not been polished into performance. Enoch's intimacy with God produced moments of revelation, though he never made spectacle of them. He would sometimes return from his private conversations with the gravity of one who had met a presiding reality. At night, by the tent door, he would tell his family in measured words of what he had seen, a clarity about the limits of human violence, a vision of the steadiness of divine justice, and an assurance that God kept covenant with those who sought him. These were not long discourses, but concise reports, given to steady faith rather than to create fevered speculation. The tension of the age tightened as the generations passed. Wickedness, which had at first been a ripple, became a swell that threatened to overtake the shores of memory. The sons who followed the line of Cain grew bold in craft and cruelty. They taught their neighbors how to bend nature to their will and how to blunt the conscience that might rise against them.
Enoch walked among these pressures with a sorrow that deepened into sorrowful zeal. He saw people made in the image of God reduced to instruments of selfish ends. Yet his response was not merely lament, it was sustained fidelity. He continued to walk, to call, and to live out the alternative life he taught. There came a time when the voice of Enoch rang with a particular firmness. At the gate where elders sat and disputes were settled, he spoke plainly. The age would not be permitted to go on as it pleased. He declared, as one convinced by revelation, that the Almighty would bring a reckoning that would cleanse and restore. His words were the words of a prophet, and though some scoffed, others listened and adjusted the posture of their lives. The writers who would later collect these accounts preserved that prophetic word, as testimony that God speaks through faithful life to warn and to call. Enoch's days were counted in the record. 300 years he walked with God after the birth of his son, and in the year of his life recorded as 365, he was no longer found among the living. The manner of his departure is given with a single astonishing phrase: God took him. It was not death as the people knew it. It was a translation that testified to a life so pleasing that the Creator drew him into fellowship without the usual passage through the night of death. Those who saw him last described him simply: he walked, and then he was taken. The suddenness of that moment did not unsettle all. It did not come with thunder or boastful display, but with a solemnity that left the witnesses trembling with wonder. The immediate aftermath was quiet and complex. In the tents there was grief that was not the grief of one who had watched a body return to dust. There was also a deep, reverent awe. Mothers held children close and spoke of Enoch as a man who had shown them the face of God by his daily steps. The elders who had argued with him in the gate now felt the weight of an absence that also carried affirmation. If a life could be so acceptable that the Almighty took it, then the way Enoch walked was not a folly, but a proper wisdom. To the scoffers, his translation became a riddle. To the faithful, it became a beacon. The testimony of Hebrews, written much later, would point to this event and say that Enoch was taken because he pleased God, a phrase that ties the act of translation to faith that is held rightly. The note in Jude that remembers him as one who prophesied of judgment roots his life in both intimacy and warning. Both recollections affirm what the simple genealogical record also declares. Here was a man whose life was measured not by the length of years alone, but the depth of fellowship. From a pastoral standpoint, the meaning of Enoch's life is manifold. First, it stands as a rebuttal to a faith that is only ritual or only ambition.
Enoch's devotion was incarnational, woven into every daily duty, not confined to hours at an altar. Second, the prophetic edge of his ministry reminds that true intimacy with God does not remove a person from the moral realities of the world. Rather, it places them inside the solemn labor of calling others back to life. Third, his translation opens the horizon of hope, that God honors those who persist in faith even when years pass and the world grows darker. There is also, woven into the genealogical pattern, the prophetic significance of Methuselah's name and lifespan. The long life of Enoch's son and the years that followed became, in the unfolding narrative of the generations, a measured interval in which mercy and warning waited. The generations that came after would name Noah and observe that the judgments spoken by the prophets took a particular unfolding of time. The memory of Enoch's life and speech held there as a steady witness against complacency. Enoch did not live as a man untouchable or untested. He loved and felt sorrow sharply. He watched kin fail and neighbors harden. He knew the pang of crying for those who would not hear. Yet his interior life bore a sustained simplicity: to walk, to listen, to speak what was given, and to keep on. That pattern, more than any single utterance, is the legacy that the faithful reading of his days preserves. In quiet moments, long after his departure, those who remembered him would speak of the way his steps had left a groove, less like the imprint of a man's shoe and more like the marking of a path. Children would follow that path at play. Elders would walk it in memory. The imagery of walking and of light became entwined in the remembrance. Enoch had been one who carried light by his manner, and who left a path that pointed upward. The story of Enoch presses upon the present with a gentle urgency. It is not a tale meant to produce despair about the world's evils. Rather, it is an encouragement that fidelity matters. Intimacy with the Maker reorders attention. It softens cruelty, it quickens mercy, and it steadies speech. The life of Enoch invites a re-examination of priorities. Shall a man or woman spend a life in the pursuit of prosperity and praise, or shall he spend it in the pursuit of being known by God? For those who take up the invitation, the way is mundane in its steps and sublime in its destination. It begins with small disciplines: rising to watch the dawn, sitting apart from the noise to speak honestly in prayer, offering tangible help to the neighbor whose need is small enough to meet and big enough to matter. It continues with a refusal to harden the heart, to choose instead the labor of reconciliation, the patient bearing of insult, the slow refusal to repay violence with violence. And it finds its consummation, perhaps not in a sudden translation, but in the quiet recognition that a life can please God by its unremarkable constancy.
Enoch's translation also cautions against looking for dramatic signs as the proof of favor. His removal from the world was not a show, but a confirmation. The one who knows the faithful will act in ways consistent with divine character. The memory of his prophetic warning presses upon conscience. A day of reckoning is part of the moral economy of the world, yet it comes with a call to return and a window of mercy. As time rolled forward, the names in the genealogy continued: Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. The memory of Enoch traveled with them like a banner of hope and warning. Those who kept his memory kept also the conviction that fellowship with God is the truest work a life can do, and that such fellowship will shape communities long after the hands that formed them have closed. So the tale concludes not with a final spectacle, but with an appeal. Emulate the steady walking. Let the rhythm of prayer and mercy mark the days. Live so that, if God were to take you, the manner of your life would be found pleasing. Let the name you bear, if it be given in faith, be a token not only of your origin, but of the time you offered to the Maker. As the story of Enoch draws near the threshold of its climax, the moment of translation that both astonished and comforted those who saw it, there remains the wider scene of what followed among the people. Methuselah grew long in years and watchful in heart. The world continued its turning toward both ruin and repentance, and the drumbeat of history approached the flood that would test all things told in the ancestral memory. The record holds these threads together, and the walking of one man stands like a lamp along a long road, urging all who follow to steady their feet and keep their gaze fixed. And it came to pass in those days that men spoke of Enoch as one speaks of a sudden star, some with wonder, some with unease. Whispers moved along the market rows and the caravan tents. Mothers hushed children with his name. The elders at the gate touched their beards and remembered his voice. To some he was a proof, plain as a sunrise, that God walked among men. To others he was an enigma that unsettled the settled ways of commerce and quarrel. Methuselah heard these things as one hears the wind along a ridge, clear, inevitable, carrying more than one scent. His house was full of years and of guests who came to sit and speak of what Enoch had spoken. He kept at a small table near the door a bowl of water and a lamp, and often he would go out into the yard at dusk and trace with a slow finger the worn line of the path that had been left. The path was not wide, many feet had crossed it, yet there was in it a clearness, as if an unseen hand had smoothed it for travel. Methuselah was not given to loud lamentation. He walked with the measured pace of one who has learned to count the seasons by prayer. When neighbors came, he received them with that same steadiness and said little of doom and little of triumph. He loved his grandchildren, and he would teach them by example, to rise with the cool air before the sun, to bring water to the benches in the courtyard, to listen before answering. In those lessons there was an urgency that did not shout. It was a gravity, like a bell tolling at dawn. Lamech, son of Methuselah, was a man of vigor and of speech. When his son was born, he named him Noah, saying, "This one shall bring us rest from our labors and from the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." The words in his mouth were both a wish and a confession. They carried a hope for remedy and an admission that the world had ceased to offer the ease the fathers remembered. Noah grew in that house under that blessing. He was reserved, given to long thinking, and his hands learned craft from a young age, plaiting ropes, shaping wood, tending flocks. He listened much to his father and to Methuselah, and the memory of Enoch touched him as a kindling might touch dry kindling, not a blaze yet, but a patient warmth. As the years passed, the watching of the old men sharpened, but the shape of the world darkened. Men multiplied upon the earth. Their settlements spread in valleys and along rivers, and with numbers came a broadening of taste for what pleases, and a narrowing of care for what holds. The heart of man, the record states plainly, grew hard. Envy and boastfulness took the place of humility. The tongue was quick to curse as to bless. The strong drove the weak aside. Stories of cruelty moved like smoke across the plain. Villages took fright at sudden violence. Lamentation rose at the hearth, and songs formerly bright grew thin. Enoch's warning, which had been simple and urgent, found both ears and deafness. Some made pilgrimages to the path he had walked, and left stones there as tokens. Others mocked the memory, and said that men were made for pleasure, that toil was the way of the world, and that counsel of old men belonged to the dust. The faithful, though fewer in number than the rising throng, held the memory with a fierce tenderness. They met in the cool under trees and at the doors of houses, and repeated what Enoch had said: to soften the heart, to speak truth, to lift mercy before wrath. Their gatherings were quiet, not for show, but for formation. God's sorrow over the increasing malice of humanity was vast and deep. He beheld the violence and the thoughts that bent toward harm, and there was a decision taken in the heart of the Maker that had weight and finality. Yet in his justice he was not without mercy. In his judgment he still remembered the possibility of return. Thus it was that the Maker prepared both word and remedy. To Noah, in his days of labor and quiet, came a clarity that others did not receive. In the hush before dawn, when the air was like glass and the first birds were listening, Noah heard the voice of God calling to him.
This for your synthesis. The voice was neither the clamor of thunder nor the whisper of wind alone. It was the summons that a father gives to a child when one must step into a task no eye but theirs can see. God declared the thing that he would do to the earth for its violence, and he gave to Noah instruction for saving a remnant. A great vessel to be made, a covering of pitch, a place for living things preserved by covenant. Noah answered as one who listens to an ancient pattern. He did not exult. He did not flee. He began the work with a steady hand, fashioning timbers and shaping planks, doing what had been set before him. When men of the town passed by the site where he worked, measuring rope, freeing a stubborn nail, testing a beam, they made mock of his labor. "What use is a ship upon the land?" they said, and they laughed and took up other matters. Parents used Noah as an object of jest to hush obstreperous children. Merchants named him a madman behind his back. Youths hurled stones at his early stacks of wood and called it a folly that a man might be building a house for the rains of never. Yet there were also patients and watchers who kept their distance and wondered.
Some elders who remembered Enoch came more often and sat by the fence and asked what they could do. Methuselah went and sat in the shadow of the growing frame and said only, "Do as you are told." He gave Noah a tool now and then, a measure, a word of old counsel. Lamech was louder in his lament and more urgent in his encouragement. "Hold fast," he would say, "for God has not forsaken his ways." Noah received help that was given in the smallness of hands, cord, pitch, a child steadying hold upon a plank. The work grew slowly, and rumor carried it as if it were a scandal and a wonder at once. In the cities and gatherings beyond, wickedness blossomed in 1,000 ways. The crafts of cunning men were used for gain without care. The counsels of the proud sought advantage at the expense of the poor. Wives mourned husbands taken in sudden raids. Children learned to avert their faces from shame because justice was rare. The earth itself seemed to answer the hardness of men with a quickening that would not be long restrained. The rivers swelled sometimes, the winds came with new stridency, and animals moved uneasy before storms. These were not in themselves the flood, yet they were like premonitory notes in a distant music. Those who remained faithful spoke often of repentance, of the maintenance of mercy. They insisted upon visits to the needy, upon returning what had been taken, upon binding wounds and calling out for justice in ways that did not mirror the aggression they opposed. But the voice of righteousness is a slender one when the drumbeat of appetite and the shout of plenty resound. Even so, some were moved, and places of shelter were prepared by discreet hands. Granaries were shared, widows found bread, and spared animals found rest.
Destouda, o tempo pode ser súbito e lentamente longo. Súbito, no sentido de que verdito foi proferido. Longo, no sentido de que uma vida deve fazer seus passos finais. As águas realçaram com justiça e com mercê interconectadas. Elas romperam a terra em uma maneira tanto terrível quanto ordenada. Das montanhas aos vales, a voz do novo elemento cobriu o antigo. Na manhã, a memória do caminho de Enoque leguia sobre chive de chuva. A lâmpada por Metusalem's bol bernava e depois, com seu último sopro, foi apagada, enquanto dormia embaixo de abrigo. Lameque chorou pelos filhos e pela geração, e Noé, que pema vigia e que pema presfu vigia over la small company that God had placed under his hand. Thus, the tale of the walking man, who had kept his feet steady and his speech restrained, meets the travail of a people and the sovereign making of the Maker. What was begun in the quiet of one heart had carried through the years into acts of obedience that saved a remnant. What was hardened in the multitude was set upon a course of purging and renewal. The lamp Enoch had carried did not snuff in smoke of spectacle. It was tended by hands that would now pass through waters and bring the witness of life into a remade world. And when the rain fell thick and the rivers ceased to speak on their banks because they had found their new courses, the faithful inside the vessel kept to their appointed prayers. They remembered the old path by heart. They told the stories of Enoch to the waiting children as light dimmed and as the world beyond the planks was swallowed in pattering sound. In those hours there was a hush of grief, a tuneful recall of mercy, and a steady hope that what had been made anew might be kept more kindly than before. The record holds these things not as a tale de vengeance alone, but as a testimony to the endurance of faithful walking.
a witness that a life given to God in small labors and in daily mercy can alter the course of history when the Maker moves. And even amid the judgment, the promise bent like a bow. The same God who brought cleansing would also guard, by covenant, the possibility of renewal for the earth and for the hearts within it. And the days went by, and the waters waxed mighty upon the earth. The fountains of the deep were stayed not until the appointed time. The windows of heaven were shut at the word of the Lord, and the waters abated by degrees. At length the ark rode upon an ocean that had become an even plain. There was no hill to be seen, nor the black of a treetop's crown, but the curved back of the world silvered with rain, and the slow, patient tossing of wood upon waters that held the memory of every valley. Noa and those com eles mantianavam-se os estações como homens postos em sua carga. Eles fizeram vigia sobre o lote onde os animais estavam dormidos, dedicaram-se aos animais filhos e acalmaram as mães com óleo e mãos gentis.
They practiced the old words of prayer that had been their compass: thanksgiving, petition, remembrance. In the bitterness of their hearts, there was grief for those who had mocked, and yet their grief blended with a steady reserve of hope. They spoke little of judgment and much of mercy. The children asked about the fields, about the orchards that would be, and the elders answered with stories of seed and season and of hands that would once more break the earth. After the fountains of the great deep were restrained, the waters did yet continue to ebb slowly. In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. It was not a sudden anchor, but a gentle lying of the vessel upon a summit, as one who lays a vessel upon a shore. The keel touched rock, the timbers creaked, an old sound of relief. And Noah put forth his hand and felt cool stone under the plank. They tarried there some days, counting the hours by the measured turning of the sun through cloud. The pillars of the vessel cast long shadow when the clouds opened, and the mouths of the animals were lifted to drink of a world that had been cleansed and made strange. Noah went out upon the deck and bowed down. His face was weathered, his beard thick as moss, and his eyes had the steadiness of a man who had borne an unbearable stewardship. He offered praise in simple speech, naming the Maker's goodness that had spared the remnant. The hands of his house answered with the old refrain, and the beasts in their pens chanted with low sounds like the sighing of flutes. Then Noah sent forth a raven. It flew and returned not again for a season, finding its food where the waters were thin and the carcasses lay drifting. And thus it made its course. After 7 days he sent forth a dove from off the ark, to know whether the water had abated from off the face of the ground. The dove flew forth, and finding nowhere to rest because the waters covered the earth, returned unto him into the ark. And he put forth his hand and pulled her unto him into the ark. Again he stayed 7 other days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. And Noah knew by that sign that the waters had lessened upon the earth. He waited yet another 7 days, and the dove returned no more unto him any more. In those small tokens there was a great comfort, the proof that the green thing could live again, that root and leaf had not been wholly swallowed. When the earth was dry at the voice of the Son, the Lord spake to Noah, saying, Come out of the ark, thou and thy wife, and thy sons wives with thee. And Noah came forth, and his sons with him, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
and their wives, and every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl after their kind.
They went forth in order as they had been appointed, the clean beasts first, then the beasts that cleave not, and the birds in measured pairs. The earth received them like a patient friend. Noah built an altar unto the Lord. He took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings upon the altar. The smoke went up as a sweet savor. The hands that had been roughened by timber and toil, now folded in the offering of thanksgiving and the naming of hope. And the Lord smelled the sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart that he would no more curse the ground because of man. For the imagination of man's heart was evil from his youth. Neither would he smite every living thing as he had done. He established a covenant with Noah and with his seed after him, saying, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, of all that come out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. God set his bow in the cloud to be a token of the covenant between him and the earth. When the cloud rolled and the light found the mist, a band of color rested upon the sky in a curved sign that men would later name. It was a quiet, steady thing, the bow rising like a promise across the heavens. And wherever it arced, the memory of flood and the assurance of restraint met in the gaze of those who watched. The Lord declared that seasons and seed time and harvest and the pulse of the years should not be broken by the utter waste of water as before. Thus he pledged the continuance of the world. The land, however, bore the marks of travail. The crops of one season were lost. The old cities lay under silt and ruin. Men who were spared walked among relics of walled courts and broken pillars and wondered at the works of their fathers. Noah and his sons took upon themselves the labor of clearing, of naming places, and of planting. They were the first of a new reckoning, and their days were given to sowing, to mending the woven vessels, and to the erecting of dwellings of the old form. They taught their children to hew wood, and to plow the virgin dust. They taught them also to speak the words of thanksgiving, and to tell of the covenant that had been placed in the vault above. Yet sorrow did not leave them. The memory of those who had perished draped itself upon feast and upon lullaby. When the children cried for vanished kin, the elders would sit and tell how the Maker's justice is neither sudden cruelty nor blind wrath, but the cleaving away of corruption so that a seed might live. They spoke of Enoch's walk as a witness to the possibility of being taken and not suffering the flood. They spoke of the long life of Methuselah and of the tears Lamech shed in the year of the rising waters. The lamentations of the past were woven with prayers that the future should fare better.